So we have a really small topic, the future of open source, or what's next. So we don't have a ton of ideas already. No, we really do need your questions. If you want questions, we do have a list of topics like we were most interested in talking, but we want it to be as adaptable to the audience and what y'all want. So I'm Jennifer Riggins. I'm a tech journalist. I specialize specifically in the cultural impact of technology because I don't tech, but I write about it and I learn from others that use it. So thank you all for joining, and bring the energy that you brought at yesterday's panel, please.
Oh, okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Samson, Goddy. I've been talking, so I'm just beginning to lose my voice. So my name is Samson, Goddy. I'm the co-founder for the Open Source Community Africa. So it's kind of a community down in Africa where we just sort of like advocate for open source. But been in open source for quite some time now, and currently doing open source at Hedera Hashgraph, and also like GitHub Star. So pretty interesting program. So yeah.
Thanks very much. Nice to see you all. I'm Matt Barker. I am here actually as entrepreneur in residence for OpenUK, and I got that job because I worked with Amanda a long time ago, and she forced me to do it. But actually, genuinely, I was a very early employee of Canonical. This is back when the office was Mark Shuttleworth's front living room. So I saw the whole growth of the Ubuntu community, and then I was a very early employee next of MongoDB, so I saw the growth of MongoDB, and then something called LXC came along, which became Docker, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. And then Kubernetes was open source, and I was like, I've got to start a company around this. So 10 years ago, I started a company called JetStack to do services around Kubernetes, and we bootstrapped, we self-funded, we created an open source project which became very successful to do X509 certificate management in Kubernetes. So we ended up donating that to the CNCF, and if you use Kubernetes, you're very likely to use that project. And then we were acquired 3 years ago, and I sold my soul to corporate America, and I'm now working for a very large cybersecurity company in the US, which actually is not as bad as it sounds. It's a really great company. Whoever's watching from Venafi, but it's called Venafi, and I'm doing a lot of work at the moment around identity and how that plays into Cert Manager, our open source project, and then policy control. So that's me in a nutshell.
Cool. I'm Ron Efroni. I'm the board member of the NixOS Foundation. I don't know if anyone's familiar with it. We're one of the top 10 GitHub communities with over 5,000 contributors. Lots of good stuff there. And also, I'm the co-founder and CEO of Phlox, where we're bringing all of that awesomeness to work. I think I did want to throw a quick joke about Amanda, because I've heard that some people work from her. I feel like we all work for Amanda. Some of us get paid. So other than that, before this, before Phlox, before Nix, I was running developer products for Facebook, so I've been around kind of in that space for a long time and care deeply about open source.
Oh, awesome. Oh, you're going to do the running. That's great. So yes, anybody that wants to ask a question, you're welcome to. Otherwise, we will continue to discuss. But raise your hand to interrupt us, because we only have half an hour and we can ramble. So I think a good place to start is talking about how weird the time is we're in right now, and the specific challenges that open source is facing. As we look to this future, we have to look to address these specific challenges of 2023 turn 2024.
Wow, it's changed a lot, and it's changed significantly at various time points over my career, which is actually at this point almost 20 years in open source, because I started it when I was still a student. Started when I was still basically a student. I think when I joined the open source community, it was almost it was a mission, it was a passion, it was a vibe, it was a community, it was a movement. No one got involved in open source because they were looking to try and make money out of it, or not really anyway. They were doing it because they just wanted to have an impact on the world, and their code to be used by people, and for it to make a difference genuinely. What we found is that obviously open source is a much better way of developing code than proprietary. And then
why?
Well, I think there are lots of reasons for that. but I think it's just for me it's the openness. It's the ability to get lots of people with lots of different backgrounds and lots of different experiences to sort of work on an outcome that when you're in one company with one idea, it's very difficult to get that right. Whereas if you've got lots of people working on it together and you're shaping it, it's almost like an organic process, and it kind of shapes to the sort of problems that are needed by the community of users. And it's almost like electric almost, because you kind of work out the software and how it responds in the community, and you get feedback from that, and you can kind of go from there, and it almost like grows into something that's almost like got a life of it. I mean, I know this sounds really weird, but it's slightly different, I think. Whereas proprietary software obviously can be very, very successful, but it's done with slightly different motivations. And I think it's just the ability to kind of like connect into that hive mind, you know, a whole collection of people with all this experience, all working towards a common goal. And I don't know, it just works. It just works better.
And you're saying it's changed for the worse, or
when
how's it changed?
I started JetStack, it was pretty. We were kind of getting to a point where a few companies had proven that you can make a commercial success out of off the back of an open source project, but there weren't that many concerns or worries about the fact that perhaps when a cloud vendor comes along and they have this humongous platform where they can take the open source software and provide it as a service, the impact that might have on the work that you've done in building and creating that piece of open source software. There wasn't the sort of the thought of maybe you being put in a position whereby you might need to look at changing your license to sort of help you to make money around it. It was. I think it was. I guess you had software as a service, you had services, and there weren't that many sort of business models in between. And so for me, it was kind of quite straightforward. It was let's do services, let's support it, let's create an open source project that hopefully is successful enough, and then at some point it'll be successful enough that we can create some kind of proprietary software on top. I think now, like more recently, because of the change in the economy and the influence of humongous VCs and investors that are now pumping huge amounts of money into companies that probably might not know exactly how open source communities work and sort of like where you should be sort of directing that energy. I think there's influences that have led organizations to make slightly sort of uncomfortable decisions.
Profit-based decision making in a business?
Yes, exactly. And I think that to me has changed the dynamics somewhat. And if I had to start a company today around an open source, like creating a business model around an open source project, I'd have to think much more carefully now around like thinking through how it would evolve, how I would protect myself, how I would license it, what the business model would be. Whereas I guess 10 years ago, it was relatively straightforward, even though it was maybe quite difficult to do. It was a relatively straightforward decision.
So I know you asked about challenges for 24, 25, and kind of to build up on what Matt was saying, I think open source, and obviously I'm biased, it's like that's the thing, right? That's where there's a lot of areas where we kind of see where humanity can do really amazing things, and open source is the culmination of that, right? It's us getting together on a joint initiative to make something awesome, and the core of it, to Matt's point, is that we're not doing it for money, we're doing it because we can do something really, really cool, and as humans, we really want to do that together, and as humans, most of us are genuinely good, and it just creates a community vibe with technology and with innovation. Now, that's the core, and I think where we're starting to see the challenges is that we're starting to see the squeeze, or what we were calling it, come in. There are multiple forces starting to push down on this concept of open source, on this concept of getting together as a community and innovating for various factors, whether it's governmental, where governments are trying to understand it and like, do we need to regulate it? It's VCs, it's money getting funding and inorganic growth coming in with mixed incentives, right? How do we monetize it? How do we create capital from it? So I think one of the biggest challenges is how do we deal with those forces as a community-wide organization? How to create consensus? I think the realm of licensing is a big one, right? We've seen companies start with a license, shift to a different license because some of these forces. And I think the latest one, obviously, is around AI, right? Where we're having, it's probably a big topic at this conference, but we're having another new force where we're not familiar with, and it has a huge opportunity to create unprecedented impact on open source. It can be net positive, where it's suddenly all of the grunt work and the PRs are done by our robot overlords, or it could be that big organizations are able to actually leverage all of this innovation that we've created and actually disincentivize our open source communities across the world to contribute back in an open way. So,
okay. I'm just going to say it's not the open source communities across the world. It is open source contributors are, what is the statistic? I think it's 4% are women and non-binary. 2% of open source contributors are from Africa, which I think is about 17% of the global population and probably the continent that could most benefit from open source. Because you mentioned capital, but open source inherently was built on the backs of human capital and a lot of privilege. Like, it's all global north, and it's not all, but the vast majority is global north of people that have this privilege to be able to contribute to open source. So I definitely want to ask you, especially because you help run the amazing organization in Africa, how can we get more people involved in the next future of open source, Samson?
To be honest, I have no straight answer. I think just to kind of touch on what Matt mentioned, I think for me, it's like the way I got into open source was, again, pure passion. I kind of discovered that, you can make money, as time goes on, through DevRel, from my own point of view. I think, again, just like what you mentioned, it was coming from a place of privilege. It was access to tools. At that point, I was mostly contributing to projects, mostly within MIT and Harvard through the Media Lab. I don't know if you here know Scratch, the Scratch programming language. So I was very heavy on that, and then the OpenUK project, those sort of things from the Media Lab was what I was involved with. But the interesting thing about those ideas was, from a user point of view, and this is kind of what the community that I'm running is trying to change. From a user point of view, there are a lot of people that just don't know yet that are using open source, but for some weird reason, it's almost impossible to see reasons why they want to contribute. So there's this. Again, speaking from privilege, I've been hired or work on a contract, or again, my day job has always been open source. I don't think I've ever done anything outside of open source since I started working in tech. I see the reason why I can contribute. There's a business reasons, which is a conversations, but there are people, and I'm sure this is not just an African thing. It's like mostly in India and Asia, like. Someone's fresh out of college trying to become, especially in this climate where you're trying to get a job, you want to be able to get a better skill. You want to get your foot to the door. Hiring went from merit-based to recommendation-based. How do people get to see all these things? It's like very, very interesting system. I think, and the reason again why the open source community in Africa started was because I got the opportunity to go to an event in Mountain View, and it was supposed to be global. And I was like, okay, that's interesting. And then I spoke with the organizers. I'm like, okay, what are the things that I can do here? Technically, the pitch was supposed to be something they would hire me to do. And then I realized that, I think it's better off me running it as a nonprofit. And then I came back home, and then I co-founded the idea with a friend in 2017. And then we started primarily focusing on advocacy, like, okay, in order for us to get people to jump into code or to do whatever thing they want to do within open source, they need to understand what it is, and not just what it is with the definition of what is coming from the Western world, because they could say, it's free and open source, but they might be working at Google or Facebook or Microsoft, Meta, and other companies, right? So, and also have the privilege to work in program office and being a developer's advocate. But again, what are the ideas of people that are just wanting to build project and get it? So that's kind of what the whole idea started from. It was more around advocacy and thanks to the GitHub report, we kind of see how that number has been growing. It went from being less than 80K dev to, as of last year, close to 1 million developers on GitHub, which is crazy. It just shows how amazing that people are doing. So yeah, again, it's just some people have the privilege to contribute full time. Some people just do it for different reasons.
So I also want to ask Jennifer as well, because I think you have a lot of thoughts on this space, and definitely diversity is one of open source's
It's a
biggest problems.
problem if open source is in, what do they say now, 97% of stacks. I have no idea how they know that number. But then open source is the future. We can't really talk about alternatives because this is what we're dealing with right now. So if we're dealing with that and it's the majority of code or the majority of code in stacks, or even if it's a tiny piece of a stack that, we've all seen that XKCD, everyone's extremely impressive corporate stack is at risk because of a teeny tiny piece of done by a single maintainer in Nebraska. We've all seen that. That's a reality. Half of all maintainers, or 46%, are unpaid. Another 26% are making like under $1,000 a month, which in some parts of the world is okay, but I also don't believe in location-based payment. So it comes down to every single company pretty much and government is reliant on open source. And yet this future, this reality we're living in is being made by very few, mostly in the global north. That's a problem. That means it's a security problem, it's a sustainability problem, it's a building things that everyone can use problem. And I think that's been a good topic. I don't know that we figured it out, but I'm glad we've been talking about it a lot the last 2 days, is people should get paid for this shit. Like, people should get paid for work they do. There was this idea that you need to volunteer for an open source project. That comes with so much privilege. More than 3/4 of the world's of women and people of color are doing 4 or 5 times more of the burden of unpaid labor as it is, like raising humans, continuing society. They should also get paid for that, but that's a whole other conference. But how it makes sense that people aren't joining these projects, and when they do, they don't feel welcome or they feel isolated. How can they get involved? And thank you for your question. No, go ahead.
I just want to give a shout out to womenofOpenSource.org, which is a small organization that I run with Ruth Cheesley, who you might have seen around. Come and get a card from me if you want to get involved or know someone who might want to get involved. Jenn just said it, there's hardly any women in tech. There's even fewer women in open source. Contributors and maintainers in open source, I can introduce you to all of us, it's tiny. And I'd like that to change.
I think there's another question here.
I had a question around bringing different levels of expertise to the table, right? In open source. In general, I know that a lot of people and a lot of the outreach, and I touched upon this in my presentation yesterday, a lot of the outreach and a lot of the advocacy around open source is primarily targeted at students and early career professionals. And this kind of leads to, it creates a barrier. Because I am one of the few people that I know personally who made their transition from a proprietary side of software to open source. And that's because I was personally interested in contributing. So I see that, a lot of people who are in open source are there right from the beginning. And they're not there because, they were incentivized to do so. They have been there because they were inducted early on. They found the benefit, and they were retained. But what about those who are in other areas, who are adopters, who are, using your projects, who are leveraging your projects? How do you, sort of overcome that barrier in convincing them to contribute to open source? Because it eventually contributes to the sustainability, and it eventually does boil back to it all contributes to the sustainability of the ecosystem in general. So I'm interested and curious if anybody has thoughts on this. Like,
So just out of curiosity, because we were talking about diversity, and I think I was trying to understand, is your question specifically about how do we promote the
How do you bring different people in? Not if the majority of open source right now is from the global north and all, that means the people that are already there are not the people we need to recruit. We need
to clarify
recruit
with her, like,
different.
you meant
Yeah.
the diverse communities, not necessarily just in general, how do we incentivize our users?
yeah,
Okay.
particularly like all across the globe. It's not even just in Asia or in Africa, right? When you talk about outreach and advocacy, a lot of it, like, you look at any outreach program across foundations, any scholarships that you get. I mean, I'm not criticizing them. They are helping people come, but
It's a mess.
Yeah,
it's a mess.
yeah.
Sure.
So to be, this is a little bit controversial.
Don't worry, this is not recorded.
Yeah. So this is yeah. I was in a room sometime in June last year in Switzerland, Open Source Congress, and this was a conversation. It was like a bunch of people from different walks of life in Switzerland, gone to Open Source Congress. I think it was hosted by the Linux Foundation, and in my own personal opinion, I think the problem here is the open source definition. And this is something that I struggle with when I'm trying to relate open source to people. So how I started was straightforward. Software engineering, you want to write code, great. Open source software, OSS, right? But if someone is doing banking, like, I don't know, something non-code, like, how does open source software make sense to someone that doesn't really write code? So it's not a matter of like, is there a universal way to say, open source, and do we really need to say source, or is source now beyond, away from like the source code? And this was a conversation that we were having whole day in Swiss, like trying to understand what that means. And the reason why this is interesting is because this is a reason why, if you're looking at things like the open source program office or some certain fields in tech, like fintech, or like other aspect of tech that is not exactly very traditional, when you talk about, oh, we want you to open source something, it's a matter of like, why and why do they need to do that, right? And I see this not just in Africa, I also see this here in places, especially in like the UK, where, for example, I used to have this role when it was in marketing, which is interesting. I was leading the DevRel team, and I spent about most of my time in the company explaining to the exec what open source was. And every single decision, when I want to sponsor something, like maybe sponsor a conference, I have to make some certain conversations on why this is important. And the reason I know that is because I took 3 steps back away from code and say, okay, I tend to look at things from an overview. So I think it has a lot to do with the definition. I don't really know what's the straightforward way to do it. I don't know if it's a thing that OSI can answer, or I don't know. But this is just an open question, and I think that if we go beyond the source, then maybe that conversation could be more open, and that's just what I think.
Another topic of longevity, Terrence next, and then you as well, that we do need to consider is, like we said, we were just talking about bringing more people on board, but then when they join an open source community, how can you recognize potential for people that are going to recruit more contributors, recruit companies, maybe pay for shit, and then be leadership? Because like Lorna said, we're talking like a handful, 2 handfuls of open source projects that we know of are run by women. Terrence, go.
I think it was really interesting that you were talking about people wanting to do open source for like the intrinsic good, and that's how I started. And I remember I got a CV from someone who was an open source contributor, and they said, and my projects have 500 stars on GitHub, and my heart just fell because it felt like they were chasing a number. But the more I think about it, actually that's kind of good. It's external validation. I mean, all right, they might have bought the stars, but they have a badge or a number or something. And I think absolutely right. We do need to find ways to pay people to do this. But I'm wondering, as we're talking about the future, what comes after that? I mean, is it just we'll give people a badge? Here's a medal for contributing to Linux, or is it here's a cash prize? What's the thing after intrinsic worth and then, numbers.
To quote Ann Curry said to me the other day, which some of us in the room know quite well, prestige butters no parsnips. GitHub stars do not equal money and do not get you a job. We need to go beyond that.
Yeah. Okay. Are you good?
I think your question is great, right? I think just to paraphrase it to make sure I understood it correctly, you're saying we have things like GitHub stars or whatever, and that's kind of a payment or makes you feel good or recognized in terms of what you've contributed. I think the bottom line question, and it's probably a wider discussion, is the person contributing, right? And we can just to align on that is definitely from the diversity side, getting and funding open source contribution is going to probably help with that. And on the other side, I don't know if everyone who's contributing to open source, and this might be a privilege thing, are necessarily looking to get paid for that contribution, right? So I can say about myself that, and again, I'm coming from a privileged position, so it's 100% aligned with that fact, is that a lot of times when I've been in open source, it's because I actually enjoyed, I don't know if I'm getting feedback from you, I've enjoyed kind of the progress that it brings, and it's kind of like to me, it felt like volunteering, right? And why I like to volunteer, and even though I don't get paid, and I also agree that volunteering is probably a privileged thing to do, and that is at least from my end. But it's very on point to open up more mechanisms to incentivize open source that are not just, hey, you're going to feel good, you're going to have some impact, and you're going to be able to potentially have a line in the resume or something like that.
Yeah. I do, personally, I do find it hard to think that we're going to get more people into open source by just paying them to do it. Everyone that I've ever met doesn't get into open source because they think they're going to get paid. I think that there is, I don't know, people do it for a different reason, to feel part of a team, to contribute, to do something bigger. But I don't think they do it to find a job. I don't think everyone just skeptically goes in to contribute to an open source project just to find a job. I do not.
Has anyone here? Yeah.
I don't think that they do. I really don't.
No, I mean, I can say about myself that that's right. But again, privilege is...
But again, obviously we have to put it through that lens as well. I think maybe what we need to get a little bit smarter with is how do we encourage more people to get in and for it easy for them to contribute and have that sense of achievement by engaging in an open source project. But then quickly, once they've got there, how do we create more opportunities for people to get paid past that? But I don't think people instantly come into the community just to get paid or find a job. That there's a bigger reason, I think, and it's more about that human, like what I was talking before. Like, I mean, Ubuntu itself is the word Ubuntu for Linux is humanity for all. It's like it's a South African word that means let's get together and create something bigger than ourselves. And that's why I got into. Well, I mean, that's why I wanted to get involved, and that's why I wanted to be canonical. And like when you go to a conference and people are there like desperate to get a CD. This is 15, 20 years ago, and like I was even me, like who was just graduate, used to get asked for autographs, sign my CD. I was like, I'm just in sales. I mean, but that was kind of quite an amazing experience. That the love and the passion for a piece of software that wasn't proprietary. And I just think that was what I thought of as the open source community. And that has changed somewhat as commercial interests have come in. But I don't think we should lose that sense of specialness that comes with actually doing something that we can all contribute on and get together around. The money comes later. Let's focus just getting people involved for doing for something bigger than just money.
Right now, though.
Yeah. So I think I kind of agree with what you're saying, but I think it's also we need to kind of look at this from a different point of view, right? So I want to say like almost everyone in this room that have been contributing to open source for more than 10 years, we're mostly doing that for like based on passion, right? So I mean, when we started, it was like, oh, there were less companies, there were a lot of less tools that were built on top of open source, but now it's a different conversation, right? Why it is a very different conversation is not a matter of like when a project makes a lot of money. So for example, I'm part of the board for Open Source Collective, and we have about 3,000 plus open source projects, including mine, and over millions of dollars being donated by organization in the platform, and then we sort of distribute that. But then the pattern that I see, again, not speaking as a board, but the pattern that I see here is it's typically the top maintainers that get paid. right? It's not a conversations of like, how do you sustain this? Yeah. So, for example, like I said, if a project, let's say a project that X company rely on, then make a custom donation of like, let's say, $10 million. And the way the current funding model is there are very high chances that the top maintainers are going to be taking San Francisco rate salary. So what that happens to people that are sending the small fixes, the important fixes. So I think that model is something that I think if that get fixed, then I don't think it's a matter of like coming to open source to get paid. It's a matter of like when there's money to get paid, there's a really evenly distribution channel that can trickle down. Yeah.
Half an hour is clearly too short be talking about that, but I want to yield last word to you because you've been raising your hand. So, and thank you everyone, but here you go.
So I'm going to be speaking on the point of view of someone that's not actively contributing to open source, so as an outsider. So you want me to come into open source now. Right, so I asked a couple of questions because I've been doing research on open source since June last year when I came for Oscar Fest and I met Samson, and I always ask him a lot of questions. I'm a designer, product designer, I'm studying that in school in my final year. So I'm hearing about open source, and the first things I heard was open source software. So it's more open source software. So it's like, it's only people that code that could contribute to open source. Now, that was the first thing got introduced to me. So the first time I heard open source software, I'm like, okay, I don't code, so it doesn't have anything to do with me. Then moving on, I heard open source is open source and there's open source software, right? So understanding from the beginning, I understood that open source is people coming together, volunteering to contribute to the community, right? And from the conversation I've had today, we're saying if you pay people, the inclusion and diversity we're looking for in the open source community will come into it. People will want to contribute more and it will help the future of open source, right? But then I'm wondering, doesn't that, downplay the interest, the curiosity of wanting to contribute to something as a community? I'm just asking questions. I don't support any part of it.
I think that's exactly like a really strong point, right? Because open source intrinsically, when you look at the community that comes around it, it usually comes around it, and again, I'm definitely putting the diversity aspect aside, but the humans that come around it for a very clean reason usually. It's for a reason because we believe in this project or we're excited about this thing and I just want to make it better so other people can also get it. So I think that's the core, that's a core value of open source to me. And you ask, do I need to code? You don't need to code in order to contribute to open source, right? We're running NixCon for the first time in North America. Someone just did our logo. They contributed to open source, right? They just made that even better.
But then lastly, right, on that one, but this is an interesting one. Yes, they don't need to code, but some certain career comes from a proprietary level. So for example, a designer coming to contribute to open source would either end up using Figma or Adobe, and those are two proprietary software that may or may not get paid compared to an engineer that would probably just, write code without any paywall. So how does that, I don't know, that's just my thoughts there.
We're asking more questions than answers, but I know we're over time, so thank you all so very much.
I thank you very much. I mean, I didn't have the heart to stop it, actually, because it's really fascinating conversation. So thank you to the panelists.